It's so nice to have you in the podcast. It was very short notice, and thank you very much for agreeing to discuss this very important issue, which is at the moment is for a lot of us is very urgent, and we are spending our own time and our own interventions in order to unravel what is happening in the field of humanities, social sciences, and the arts. So thanks very much, Jaspal. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Yes. Jaspal, we'll start off with your story. Your story, as in a sense, like how you work in the intersections between the social sciences, arts, and humanities. Like, what kind of an engagement do you at the moment, or like in general, do?
Great. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and the opportunity for me to speak to you. My name is Jaspal Singh. I'm a assistant professor at the University of Hong Kong at the moment. I did much of my education in Wales in the United Kingdom, but I'm originally from Germany, so I did some education here as well. In all those three contexts, arts, humanities, social sciences means something slightly different.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very happy to start off with this question. I guess I'm a sociolinguist, and over here you can already see that social sciences is sort of like implicated in this. Many sociolinguists see themselves as social scientists, and they work in social science departments. I myself have never actually worked in the social science department, and well, at the beginning, I was a bit unhappy that I was always in the humanities with all the literature people and the historians and so on. I thought, like, no, my work is more like social sciences. I'm much more happy now to actually have moved away from social sciences,
right.
Moved more into a humanities type of research environment, at least. That is because I think social sciences are in some ways positivistic, and less reflexive than the humanities. And I'm sort of doing both in some ways, right? I do somehow want to inform and describe and show facts and so on, but I also always want to reflect and critically reflect. And I think the humanities are, in my experiences at least, doing a really good job at that. And so that's why I'm very happy in the department that I work in now, in the School of English at the University of Hong Kong, because we have literature people, we have cultural studies people, we have linguists, and we have an environment in which reflection and speculation and philosophy, in some ways, play a role and are seen as valid types of research, engagements. So that's kind of who I am. Maybe I can say a few words about my research. I'm working ethnographically, so I'm doing I would say I'm a linguistic ethnographer or a linguistic anthropologist. And so that means I go out into a particular social cultural environment, and I spend a lot of time in that social cultural environment, and I try to understand how language as well as society and culture sort of work, right, from the ground up, from how the people themselves understand what they do with language and how they understand language ideology, how they understand cultural life in general. And my largest research project so far has been a piece of research, ethnographic research I did in Delhi, in India, in the emergent hip hop community over there. That was like 7 years ago now. And I've written my PhD on that, and I'm now publishing articles and a book on that experience. And ethnography means, in that sense, that I put myself into that context. I'm not just the objective researcher. I am myself a participant. I am producing the data that I'm
Mm-hmm.
analyzing. So that's where the reflexivity comes in. And that's why I feel much more sort of at home in the humanities at this
Absolutely.
point in my career, at least,
Mm-hmm.
um, where, you know, where this is sort of allowed and it's not just, you know, it's not, I often sometimes feel in the social sciences, the research is sort of outside. So
Mm-hmm.
if you did the research or I did the research or the next person did the research, it doesn't matter. The data is there and whoever describes it will describe it in the same way. And I think that's not true. I think we need to like really, you know, put the researcher into the picture. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm very interested in your research on the hip hop cultures and especially what you've done in India. And I've also seen a small video clip of, like your engagement as well in the sort of the research, I guess. So like working at such intersections can be sometimes precarious, just by, like, say for instance, sometimes we might feel, okay, where do I belong exactly in terms of my research or in the field, or like we absorb things from the things that that are very responsible or ethical from other fields, and then we try to enrich our research and make it a very ethical engagement, right? So, in terms of your engagement, your interventions, especially in the area of hip hop culture, how do you think this idea of like there can be chance to sort of encourage people, encourage students to look at humanities in a different way, or look at the humanities in more kind of innovative kind of thinking, because I understand not a lot of people are, at least in Sri Lanka, are aware that in the humanities that the hip hop studies kind of a field is there. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think this is a very important question, very broad question, I think. So
Yeah.
the interesting point about like engagement and ethics here is that the people who I research, when I go to that community and I say
Mm-hmm.
I'm a researcher, they don't know what that is.
Mm-hmm.
They think I'm maybe a journalist or a
Right.
filmmaker, right? So the notion of research itself, right, as how do you identify yourself in the field,
Mm-hmm.
is something that is sometimes not accessible to the people that we research. So
Absolutely.
they don't have an understanding necessarily, partly because they're not university educated, or they are not, they've never heard of that term, or they associate it with something else, maybe journalism or another field, right? Which
Mm-hmm.
I'm certainly not. As well, I mean, I've seen journalists come in at the same time when I was doing my research,
Right.
and I've seen how they work, right? And they work
Right.
in a very different way. They have a deadline tomorrow, right? And they say, you go and look at the hip hop community. They go in for 1 hour, like ask some questions, and they go out and write, and my
Mm-hmm.
work is obviously very, very different. And
Mm-hmm.
so I had to the people I research, and who I became friends with over the course of 8-9 months of doing research,
Mm-hmm.
I had a particular responsibility of explaining to them sort of what research is and what it is that I do with the data that I extract, the interviews that I conduct, the field notes that I write, the pictures that I take. What
Mm-hmm.
will happen to it, right? Because they often think, oh, okay, there's this man coming from the West, right?
Absolutely.
He will like write some book, he tells us.
Mm-hmm.
So we will have some cool pictures of us,
Mm-hmm.
like in a magazine, right, or in a newspaper, or in a sort of video, that commercial video or something, or in a documentary, right? So it is a question of representation. Now, if I go and do critical research,
Mm-hmm.
I'm instantly in an ethical dilemma, because I
Absolutely.
go home, right, with that work, and I apply all that research terminology, all that analytical philosophy that happened over the last like 2,500 years, right? I know that more or less, right? And I apply that to the data. Now, this is a type of writing and a type of analysis that our research participants, in most cases, don't have access to, unless we do research with academics, right? That is maybe the only exception, right? That they understand who is Foucault, who is blah, 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 right? So they, like my research participants, have no understanding of the type of research I do. So I write in my critical fashion in order to obtain a PhD, to convince my supervisor, to convince my examiners, to convince some sort of editor of a journal, right? I speak that type of language. So I write in this fancy way, and I give it back to my research participant and say, hey, can you read this and check if you are happy how you are being represented? And they just go, I have no idea what you're writing. I can't even read the first two sentences. And that is a problem, right? That is a massive ethical problem, because now I am writing about them, but to a completely different audience. So I'm excluding them from the conversation. I'm like, okay, I'm good, your data. And it's like almost like animal documentary, right? So you're observing this bird in the tree, right? And the bird doesn't know you're being observed. You make a nice documentary for another human being. The bird doesn't get anything out of it. So now we have to rethink what do my participants get out of it, right? And in that sense, I think research needs to be activists, right? We need to now, it's not only about representation of these people in the right way, it is also giving something back while we are doing research. That was my solution, at least. I started working with them with, the upcoming like hip hop community over there by opening a little studio, for instance, in my flat, and allowing them to record, right? And in these studio sessions, I sort of said, I'm not going to do anything for my research. I'm just going to like give them something, right? Try to pass my knowledge down to them to understand, how the recording works, or how, pass on knowledge, basically. Also, I've tried to, produce music with them together, so that our engagement, our relationship becomes one of collaborators, one of friends, rather than researched. And I think this is very important for ethnography. And even to the degree that I feel, and I'm starting to do that now, right? So those of the research participants who listen to this now, even to the degree that I want to give money, right? And that is often something that is seen as something immoral almost, or like something very, very problematic in the research community, right? Giving money, if they need it, and some of my participants do need money most urgently, right? They can now record by themselves. They can even represent themselves. They don't need me to do this. But the one thing that I can offer now with the job at Hong Kong University is I have a bit more money. And they're struggling with money. So why not give them a bit of money from my own pocket, right? So that is a sort of like personal ethical commitment that I'm experimenting with, and I'm not sure if this is the right way to do it, or if I'm running into a massive problem with this. But I kind of feel like if they are struggling, they have helped me to obtain my PhD. I'm now a doctor. I now get paid from an institution. I want to share a bit of this money. I feel it's my responsibility. Yeah. Now that is one side, like just like very briefly coming into the students, right? That is now completely different, of course. That is like, uh, I'm not even sure how to answer that question, but I feel like some of my students, at least those students who are in a course, in the courses that are explicitly about ethnography,
Mm-hmm.
when I talk about my research to them, they understand, hopefully, right? They understand that research is not something boring, or like if you want to do serious research, then it's not that you have to do something really boring and grown up, right?
Right, right.
Uh, yeah, you can actually, and you are doing best when you are researching what you yourself are passionate about, even if it
Mm-hmm.
is something like hip hop, which
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, considered in society often as, you know, youth culture. It's not serious, it's fun,
Mm-hmm.
it's blah blah blah, it's
Right.
dangerous even,
Mm-hmm.
or you know, it's problematic, and it's not worth real research. Real research is about something technical, or it is about something politically relevant, or whatever, or
Mm-hmm.
socially relevant, right? And
Mm-hmm.
hip hop often doesn't belong into that, and or is not, you know, considered as that. But I think the emerging field of hip hop studies, global hip hop studies, does, you know, promote hip hop as a socially relevant topic to
Mm-hmm.
research, becoming
Mm-hmm.
more and more important across the world, I think. And that is really the main point that I want to put across to my students, as well. You know, that they should
Absolutely.
know whatever they want to study. And it's game, like some of them study gaming, right?
Uh-huh.
Online gaming. It's similar to hip hop. It's like, it's
Mm-hmm.
not serious. Come on, online gaming, right? But you know, like one of my students did an incredible piece of research, her BA thesis
Mm-hmm.
on gender and gaming, right? And it's mind-boggling, right? It's like it's so important and so
Mm-hmm.
good. So online gaming is one of those things, or you know, music, dance. I had one student. She looked into the fish market, you know, because she loves fish, and she always
Right.
goes to the fish market, right? And they say, why don't you just go to the fish market and talk to the vendors, and how do they sell their stuff, right? So these kinds of more mundane, everyday topics are very,
Mm-hmm.
very central to ethnography, I think, and that is really what I want to promote, and I want to,
Mm-hmm.
you know, across to my students, and I hope that they just follow their own passion
Mm-hmm.
and their own interests, rather than thinking, oh, I have to do something serious, what some old professor tells me to do. I
Right.
want to, you know, just like do whatever you are passionate about,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it
Mm-hmm.
might be something that is not yet seen as a serious topic for research.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And that brings us to the more serious question, like, what about the humanities? Now, as a kind of a field of uh, scholarly work or academic engagement, or a discipline, to put it into more like kind of frame,
Mm,
what is happening to humanities right now, especially I think we are also at the cross section where the COVID-19 is also a factor now contributing to some of its, you know, the exacerbation of the crisis. So what is your take on that, Jaspal? Maybe in the context you teach, the like, how do students think about the discipline, and how do students sort of think about a future that is at the same time very reassuring for them?
right, yeah. Hmm. I'm not so sure if I can answer that last
Hmm,
part of
hmm,
your
hmm,
question with the students.
hmm,
Um, but I think in my answer to you, like maybe the perspective of the student also comes in.
hmm,
It's interesting that you bring up the pandemic.
hmm,
Um, and I maybe just want to start with that very briefly. The I think the COVID-19 pandemic has actually, in some ways, helped the humanities, because, as you know, for instance, the work I do with DiscourseNet, you know, that is a channel
yeah,
that we, both of you, us, got, you know, uh,
got
heard
to
of
know
each
each
other,
other. Yeah,
got
yeah.
to know each other, and perhaps, right, without COVID, we wouldn't have met.
Hmm,
So DiscourseNet, for instance, is is a sort of very loose network of researchers spread across the world, and our main activity was always conferences, right? So, and that was great. That was really, and they're still amazing. I love conferences. But the problem with conferences is they're in Northwestern Europe most of the time. It's very difficult for people from the global south to participate in these conferences. Now we have, due to COVID-19, we have sort of, in March, we had this crisis meeting, right, in DiscourseNet. We thought, what are we going to do? We have like 3 conferences coming up. Like, what's going to happen? And Johannes Angermüller, our sort of the president of DiscourseNet, has really pushed us to say we need to go online. And most of us were very reluctant. We said, no, like online is not the same, and this and that. But we had no choice, right? And Johannes has really pushed that and encouraged us to, put our events online and try new formats. And we did. And I think to some degree, right? To some degree, it has helped the humanities and the social sciences and the arts, and maybe all the sciences. Because now we can reach out to people across the world. The only problem we really have at the moment is time difference. That is the main problem. And of course, there's still a sort of digital divide, right? I'm not saying that we can reach out to everyone, because not everyone is digitally enhanced, right? So you are in Sri Lanka right now, you have internet connection, you have a computer, right? But not everyone has that, right? To other places in the world, that is even more, probably there's more divergence. But those people who we can reach now are just spread out across the world more globally. And that is a real opportunity, I think. And we get to hear voices that we haven't heard before. And at the end of the day, all we need to do is write, read, and talk, right? We don't need a lab. We don't need a lot of like equipment in the humanities. Basically, we just need to read, write, and talk. And we can do that on the computer. So if we have a computer, that gives us an internet, that gives us a real opportunity. So that's sort of a positive offshoot of very, very serious and horrible pandemic that we're witnessing, right? Now that's something positive, but I think if you take out COVID-19 for a moment, I think we are witnessing at least 3 problems in the humanities since at least 100 years. And I've actually, in preparation for this interview, I've picked up this book. Edmund Husserl, I speak German, so it's Die Krise der europäischen Wissenschaften und die transzendentale Phänomenologie. We forget about the second part. It's the crisis of the European sciences, right? And in this book, written in 1935, as a little piece of knowledge, Edmund Husserl was a Jew. He worked in Germany and Austria, and 1935 was 2 years into the Nazi regime in Germany. So he started and he was very old at that time. He died 1 year before the start of the First World War, so in 1938, out of old age. So he didn't really see the Second World War and the Holocaust. He would have probably been killed, murdered in the Holocaust, because he was he was a Jew. So he writes in his kind of final work about how the sciences, and in Germany, we don't make a difference between, we just say Wissenschaften, which means like sort of the knowledge.
Right.
It's similar to Veda, actually, right? Like the word Wissen and Veda is actually related. So it's about knowledge. We don't make that very strong distinction between natural sciences and arts and humanities, right? So it's kind of more blurred. So he talks, as a philosopher, he talks about this problem, the crisis of the European sciences or humanities or philosophy. And he points out 3 things, or 2 things at least, that we see nowadays still at play. The first thing is objectivity and quantification. right? So there is a regime since 100 years of quantifying everything,
Okay. Mhm.
right? And an objective piece of knowledge is that which is quantified.
Mhm.
There's more of something than there, right? It's a comparative, it's trying to say more and less. It's all
Mhm.
about statistics, likelihood, more, right?
Right.
More often, more frequently. When we write,
Mhm.
and I'm experimenting with this, try to write an article without the use of the word more, right?
Mhm. Okay.
It's very difficult. It's very
Mhm.
difficult, or
Mhm.
frequently, or similar words like this
Mm.
that suggest some sort of quantification, right? Counting.
Mm.
And often in the humanities, I just said that, right? Often is another, yeah? In the humanities, we do that
Mm.
because that is convincing. It's a convincing argument to say, oh, in philosophy, we often blah, 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 right? Um, and but it is sort of this quantification that takes, he argues, the
Mhm.
substance of philosophy and humanities out of the equation, right?
Right.
It is,
Mhm.
it is because philosophy is a fundamentally qualitative discipline, an interpretative one,
Mm. Mm.
in which the researcher herself needs to come into the picture. And he writes about that already, although he's not an ethnographer, right?
Mhm.
But
Mhm.
Husserl writes about the perception of the researcher, right? Which is
Right.
always, from researcher to researcher, we have a different take on things, right?
Mhm.
So we need to take that into account. And I think we have moved on into the sort of regime of quantification in the last 100 years, with more and more numbers and the justification of truth is
Mhm.
always scientific in the sense of counting and
Right.
statistics. And
Mhm.
we see that with COVID now, right? Like whatever, New Zealand is doing better than UK.
Mhm.
Doing better in what? They have less death, right? Like, so every death is brutal and
Absolutely.
is terrible. But we are
Mm.
saying like, oh, they only have
Mm.
2,000 COVID deaths, related deaths, right? And America has 60,000 or whatever, right? So we are quantifying that,
Mm.
right? And
Mm.
so and to the degree that we are even now quantifying ourselves with our I don't even know what it's called again. I forgot the sort of the index scores of the journals that we publish
Journals. Mm.
in, the ranking of the universities, um, and the sort of there's an H index or something, that
Mm.
how many times have you been
Cited.
stated
Mm.
and this
Mm.
and that, right? So we are quantifying ourselves, and that is, I think, the second problem with the humanities now. This is the marketization, right?
Mhm.
The marketization of the universities, where sort of neoliberalism has entered um, the universities very much, and we've fully embraced that, and it's become a business.
Mhm.
And in the business, all what counts is numbers, right?
Mhm.
Oxford is better than Edinburgh, and Edinburgh is better than whatever, right? And the UK is generally better than Hungary, and Hungary is better than Sri Lanka, and
Mm.
Sri Lanka
Mm. Mm.
is better than, right? So it's this kind of idea of ranking on a global scale that have had incredibly negative effects, I think, on,
Mhm.
especially from my perspective at least, the humanities, because your knowledge as a Sri Lankan researcher is as valid as someone who is studied in the Ivy League university in America. It doesn't actually matter, but still you are going to have a harder time to get the
Mhm.
job, get published, blah blah blah, right? Just because you are from a place that is ranked lower, right?
Mhm.
So I guess so that's, I think, the second big problem. And I think the third problem that we are seeing right now in the last decade even is freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm.
With the authoritarian regimes in India, in the USA, in Brazil, in China, um, as well as probably in several other countries and sort of national contexts, we see a curtailing of freedom of speech. So,
Mm-hmm.
so that is something that is very, very worrying, and really limits um, the humanities and the arts and the social sciences, because everything we do is political,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no way we can like talk about language, or we can talk about discourse, or we can talk about society without it being in some ways political,
Mm-hmm.
right? You are maybe a physicist, or maybe a whatever chemist or something. Maybe you can like do research that is sort of non-political.
Mm-hmm.
Although the big physicists like Einstein and everything, they have clearly intervened in political, at that level, you
Mm-hmm.
have a responsibility, because if you can build a nuclear bomb, you would also have to say, guys, don't use it, right? That's what Einstein did, right? He said, oh my God, I've created the possibility of destruction of the world through a nuclear bomb. I need to become political at that point and say, if Hitler gets this bomb, we are doomed.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so I think actually no science or no academic engagement can be totally apolitical, right?
Mm-hmm.
But especially the humanities and social sciences are political, and I think it's very worrying to see these, authoritarian men who lead these big states. Like if you imagine, like biggest, most important nations of this world: Russia, USA, China, India, Brazil,
Mm-hmm.
right? All those like five biggest,
Mm-hmm.
UK, you could even say, the biggest nations of this world, the most important nations are led by
Yeah.
very, 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 very worrying
Mm-hmm.
individuals,
Mm-hmm.
and their entourage. So it's very worrying to see that happening, the freedom of speech. And I think this is something Husserl, coming back to this, has
Mm-hmm.
not written about very much in this book, because he hasn't seen the effects of Nazi Germany.
Mm-hmm.
Another book that came out sort of a couple of years later was, and the whole work of Theodor Adorno
Mm-hmm.
and Max Horkheimer, for instance. They write for instance, in their Dialectics of Enlightenment, they
Mm-hmm.
write about the effects of the authoritarian Nazi regime
Mm-hmm.
on what can be said and what cannot be said, and the sort of whole freedom of academic knowledge.
Absolutely.
Um, so that is something. There is literature on that. If you look at
Mm-hmm.
past regimes,
Mm-hmm.
right, or past authoritarian regimes, philosophers have written about it. It's all there. We need to now, at this moment in time, go back to this work, right, and look at what did they think of it? What did they struggle with? What was their oppression? And can we, in some ways, anticipate and prevent
Mm-hmm.
some of that danger um,
Absolutely.
in our current moment as well?
Mm-hmm. Jaspal, so how do you bring this kind of conversation, engagement, activist engagement, this kind of dialogue initiatives into your classrooms in Hong Kong, especially those language students?
Poof. Censor myself. There's been a new
Yeah.
law that was passed in a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
It's called the Security Law,
Mm-hmm.
um, which curtails freedom of speech in Hong Kong. So the word, there's a you cannot say independence anymore,
Right.
for instance, right? So they're
Right.
talking about the I word now,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting. The previous years, what I have done is, where this law was not in enacted yet.
Mm-hmm.
What I've done was I informed students about the injustices of communist China, right? I talked about Tiananmen Square 1989, for instance. Showed the squashing of the protest, for instance. Many knew about it, right? So if just as a context, like in 2014, the umbrella movement in Hong Kong started as a mass protest against against certain laws in Hong Kong and certain political, I'm not going to go into details, but
Yeah,
a certain
yeah.
political, they were fighting for democracy, basically, which was granted by them through the Sino-British contract, 1997. Britain said, we're going to give back Hong Kong. There's a handover back to China, but we will grant 50 years of sort of freedom and securing of democratic structures in Hong Kong, and that has not been granted. So there was no democratic elections. There were certain things that you couldn't say. But 2014 was still very, very free in Hong Kong. People went to the streets, took the streets, and there was a lot of research done on that particular 2014 movement, the umbrella. So I started reading with my students these pieces of research, and we talked about protest movements more generally. We talked about the symbolism of protest movements, for instance, this kind of idea of the umbrella, right, as a symbol, the color yellow as a symbol. The sort of the statues, or not statues, but the sort of I don't know how to call it, the sort of effigies of liberty, right? And liberty in New York, and there was a statue of democracy in Tiananmen Square, 1989. In 2014, they also made big statues that held up like a torch of light, symbolizing freedom, right? Like Statue of Liberty in New York, and they made these and they pushed them around on the protest. So we talked about the intertextuality and the symbolism of these symbols of protests, the language involved, and so on, and the creativity really of young people, protesting. And then last year, the protests went wild in Hong Kong. So there was a resurgence of protests. It went very violent. Our university was squatted by the protesters, and there were fights on the university with the police. There were clashes. It was very, very brutal. Tear gas. The city was tear gassed every day almost. You couldn't really go out. It was terrible. It was a terrible act of violence. And while I was teaching, I was teaching in that environment, of course, and my students were they were very silent in the classroom. You were asking particularly about the classroom. In class, there's a sort of culture in Hong Kong that you don't really speak, right? You don't really like, when there are like 20, 30, 50 people in the class, you don't really hear anything revolutionary. Actually, it was only the Western students and the Indian students and the Pakistani students, the Bangladeshi students who came on. They were very vocal about it, right? They were, so like this and this. But, most of the local Hong Kong students were, no, right. They don't speak. Right? It's part of the culture. It's part of the culture to not really speak in public, which is totally fine. But when they write and when they come to my office hours, all of a sudden they open up, right?
Right.
And they write very, very radical things, to the degree that I already said, like, oh, it's a bit too pathetic what you're writing. Like, I'm going to die for Hong Kong. It's very patriotic, right? And
Right.
there was I had to almost say like, calm down a bit. Like,
Right.
don't be too like sort of pathetic in your love for Hong Kong, right? Which on the flip side also meant racism towards mainland Chinese
Mm-hmm.
people, right? So they said things like sometimes, like they are like uncivilized. The people are uncivilized. I said, come on, guys, like it's not about the people, right? Your fight is not with the Chinese person, right? If you want to fight, then like talk about politics, but don't talk
Mm-hmm.
about people that they are uncivilized or like rude or anything like that. That's nonsense. Come on, this is racism, right? This is like that's not what we're going to do. So I had to like calm them down almost a bit. And I'm myself a very like radical person actually. So I found myself in a position where I had to, tone down my students, not because of some authoritarian regime saying, Jaspal, you need to come, but because I found it was going a bit too much, right? Now, in the last couple of weeks, the new national security law has passed where you cannot say certain things. And I'm very worried now. I'm very, very worried about my students. I don't know if um, the essays that they submit as their assignments will be scrutinized, will be surveilled by some
Mm-hmm.
authority. I don't know who has access to these digital um,
Databases and all that. Yeah.
portals that we
Mm.
use and so on, right? The Zoom, for instance, right,
Mm. Mm.
is not a very secure software, right? In
Mm.
some ways,
Mm.
is being recorded. Everything is being, the Zoom company has access to this content, right,
Mm.
and could theoretically pass it on or shut down accounts, which has already happened in Hong Kong. They shut down certain Zoom accounts where
Mm.
the students or where protesters would organize themselves. So all these things are very, very worrying. And I'm yet to hear from my line manager and the dean of our faculty and so on, what is the official, how does that actually affect our teaching? Right. So when I start teaching in a couple of weeks, I will have to have that knowledge because I need that information because I need to know, am I at risk? Right.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Maybe not. Maybe they don't want to like, uh, you know, um, create a diplomatic problem with Germany because I'm a German citizen. Maybe not, right?
Mm.
Am I at risk? And even more importantly, are my students at risk because
Mm.
they are the ones who live in Hong Kong, right? So can they say everything in their essays, or do I need to tell them there's certain things that you cannot say?
Right.
And I don't know. I don't have that piece of information yet. So I'm waiting for the next because this new law has been passed a
Mm.
couple of months ago.
Weeks ago.
I'm
Yeah.
waiting to understand exactly how does that affect our teaching, our freedom of speech, our academic freedom, and even more importantly, our students' safety in the classroom and in their writing, right?
Mm-hmm.
And assessment. So do we need to change maybe the assessment? I don't know. Do I then say, oh, we are not going to use the digital platform, please write in hand, and like bring it to my office and we only have one copy that only I can read, I don't know. These are some strategies, I guess, that we need to play around with if
Mm-hmm.
we want to avoid putting people at danger.
Absolutely.
That is a
Um,
big question still. I
yeah,
can't.
absolutely, absolutely. Just while we are moving on to like kind of the end of the session, so I will just ask you a bit of like a more general question again. Um, we have this idea of that we should reinvent the humanities. We have to reimagine the discipline.
Yeah.
Um, I would just like to know about your thoughts
Mm,
of this whole idea of reinventing,
mm.
reimagining, and if so, how should we go about this?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of connects to the first point I talked about qualitative and quantitative. I think, no, I'm not saying quantitative humanities or quantitative social science is not good or anything like that's absolutely not what we need. Statistics,
Mm-hmm.
very, very important. We need numbers,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. But I think if you work qualitatively, then do so radically.
Mm-hmm.
That is, be almost anti-quantitative, right? That is sort of my
Mm-hmm.
in the sense that you check yourself, how does quantitative terminology and ideas kind of smuggle, how are they smuggled in into your
Mm-hmm.
writing and your research, right? With
Okay.
frequency, saying something like often,
Mm-hmm.
more,
Mm-hmm.
frequent, right? I'm not saying like stop using these words, but if you use these words, be sure that you have empirical evidence for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
That you actually counted something, that you actually measured something. And I often read in my reviews, when I do reviews for journals or friends or for books that I edit, that people are smuggling this in, but they don't actually have any evidence that this phenomenon is more frequent or more often, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think that is one way of like checking ourselves, be qualitative, almost hardcore qualitative if you decide to be qualitative.
Mm-hmm.
The second point I think is this whole discussion about decolonization of knowledge and decolonization.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
It's a big kind of word. I
Yeah.
wish we had power to speak about this. We can maybe do
Yeah.
that at another. But decolonizing knowledge and decolonizing education and decolonizing the institution, that is
Mm-hmm.
the basic level. That's like, just bring in more women of color, bring in more people from different places of the world, just on a quantitative level. It's
Mm-hmm.
very simple, very simple. Just bring in more of those people, because they will tell you a different story. They will tell you an alternative story, just by by nature of their gender, their sexuality, their color,
Mm-hmm.
right? And their sort of in upbringing and understanding of the global South. So I think that is a big point that we all need to look at. And I think the third one is self-critique, right? Be reflexive of what you do, but not so much in a sort of paranoid or harmful way, right? I kind of say, oh, kind of like I need to like beat
Right.
myself
So,
stronger.
mm.
Like, it's self-care, right? Self-care. Be kind to yourself, as a humanities and arts student and researcher, because the whole world has become very, and it's to do with the quantification, it's become very rigid. And if you don't have that ranking, and if you don't have these journals, then you are not good, right?
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of decolonizing that, we need to, I guess, first become confident and believe in ourselves. And I think that is something we need to do, by doing like self-care, like being really kind and gentle to yourself, right? And
Mm-hmm.
say, yes, what I'm doing, even if it is, I'm looking at some medieval documents, or like some medieval poetry or ancient poetry or something like that, which is not really relevant, the world
Mm-hmm.
says.
Mm-hmm.
It is. It is. And please never ever buy into the narrative that any generation of knowledge is not relevant. I've just heard in, I think, Cambridge University, they have a think tank. They look at the future of humans
Uh-huh.
10,000 years from now, right? So they're
Okay.
envisioning what is human society like 10,000 years from now. And it's like completely irrelevant to any politician or to any society even, right? But we need this type of research, imaginative research,
Mm-hmm.
a sort of confidence with that. And I think one of the techniques to do that is, um, what's the word? What's the opposite of acceleration? Deceleration, like making things slower. slow reading, slow writing, slow science, slow publishing, slow careers, right? Don't go all like, I publish and perish, publish or perish, publish or perish. Like, I need to do this now. Oh God, I'm too old, right? There's this drama of like, in students even, oh God, I'm 22 and I'm still a student. I started studying when I was 23. I didn't even get to my undergraduate until I was 30, right? So in Germany, I love that old system in Germany. It didn't really matter. Take time, 16 semesters, it's fine. You'll find your way, right? And I sat in the classroom with people who were 50, 60. But now in the sort of Anglophone, more marketized university, everyone is 21 or 7. They start with 17. If you haven't finished your BA with 21, you are already a mature student, right? And you're almost embarrassed. God, I'm 3 and I'm still sitting with these 21-year-olds. Chill out, everyone. Like, slow down, right? Everyone's life is different, and we need to cultivate a slow approach to science. And I think that is to do with self-care as well. If you can't read this book or this article in 1 hour, then just take 5 hours and that's fine. Or take 2 days, take a break, drink some tea, right? Just like calm down a bit, decelerate. That would be sort of my sort of strategy for reinventing the humanities in a world which is increasingly quantified, which is increasingly marketized, right? And there's more and more pressure to do everything quicker and to do everything faster. But we have to understand that humanities and arts are, they are imaginative sciences, and those who imagine, they need time. We need time, and we need some nice birds and plants around us, right? This is important. Otherwise, we're being creative.
I just remember when you said that Spivak says humanities enables slow cooking of the soul. Yes, not like giving fast forward results. So
yes,
yeah,
yes,
absolutely.
I like that.
Jaspal, we are going to wind up. Do you have any like final remarks, that something that you missed or something that I failed to ask you, or anything that you would like to add? Oh.
Well, no, I think I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much for your really important questions and your initiative in the first place to do something like this, and to get people's sort of honest and sincere opinions about the state of the humanities. And I think in that sense, you are doing something very important, which is stepping back for a moment from the particular research agendas or this or that, moving out and zooming out a bit and saying, like, where are we now, right? In terms of history, but also in terms of sort of our own individual lives vis-a-vis our academic engagements, right? Which is often seen as a job, right? As a career. But at the end of the day, you just said, we are independent. We're all independent. Maybe we work at a university, and we get, that's great, right? But at the end of the day, if I have a job or if I don't have a job, it doesn't affect my desire to research. So I kind of, and I think it's sort of like a tribe of people, right? Knowledge seekers, soul seekers, who really want to understand and put things together and reflect. If they give us a job, great. If they don't give us a job, we'll still do it. And I think that is the beauty of it, right? So I think we can all chill a bit. And maybe if you don't have a job, what I did, I just went before I did got a fantastic job at Hong Kong University. I was a dishwasher in an Indian restaurant in Cardiff, right? For two, while I was cleaning my glasses, my mind was going, right? And I came home and I wrote, or the next morning. And I think doing like sort of a job that doesn't really require your mind is actually not always the worst thing for a researcher, because you can really zone off and like do your automated job, right? And in that time, your mind actually has some time to meditate and to reflect. Yeah.
Thank you, Jaspal. Thank you very much for engaging with this initiative and sharing experience, the way you interact with, the world around you, so that, we're trying to make it a better place. So I think at the end of the day, that's what all of us want to do, in terms of our engagement as political beings, like social beings. Thank you very much, Jaspal. Really, really appreciate your presence. Yeah,
Thank you very much.
thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Take care. Bye.